It's Tuesday, 5 November. Welcome to the PDB Afternoon Bulletin. I'm Mike Baker, your eyes and ears on the world stage. Let's get briefed. First, as Americans make their way to the polls on this election day. Oh, is it election day? I didn't even know there was a campaign. We'll bring you the latest updates on early voter turnout and why election analysts warn that the sands could still significantly shift as vote counting begins later this evening. Then, an update on the war in Ukraine, as the first reports emerge that Ukrainian forces have now engaged in combat with North Korean troops who are there fighting on behalf of Russia. But first, our afternoon spotlight. With Election Day now in full swing, I wanted to take just a moment to look at early voter turnout in some critical swing states and why election analysts are urging caution from both sides when it comes to declaring premature victory for either Donald Trump or Kamala Harris. While we still have to wait, of course, on actual vote tallies, that would be a good thing, pundits and pollsters are already pouring through the data regarding early voter turnout in an attempt to read the tea leaves before polls close later this evening, because that, of course, is what pundits and pollsters do. As we discussed on this morning's PDB, nearly 80 million, that's 80 million Americans, opted to vote early in 2024, with roughly 41% of early voters registered as Democrats, 39% registered as Republicans, and 20% listed as unaffiliated. While the COVID pandemic caused some 70% of all voters to cast their ballots early or by mail in the 2020 election, analysts estimate that for the 2024 election, the share of early votes will account for roughly 50% of the total. While Democrats have the slight edge when it comes to early voter turnout on paper, there is no way, of course, to know who they may have cast their vote for this go-around. We should also note that Republicans have significantly increased their share of early voting over 2020. Analysts say this, quote, closing of the gap is notable ahead of today's vote, as Republicans are also expected to vote in person on Tuesday in higher numbers than Democrats, who favor early and most particularly mail-in voting. With that said, let's take a look at some of the critical swing states where, as we discussed this morning, the final polls have Trump and Harris in a relative dead heat. Republicans have made up a larger share of the pre-election vote than in 2020 in 4 of the 7 key swing states, specifically Arizona, Nevada, North Carolina, and Pennsylvania. Data released by the Pennsylvania Department of State on Tuesday morning reveals that nearly 2 million ballots have already been cast, with returns from registered Democrats outnumbering Republicans by 2-1. Analysts note, however, that nearly 100,000 more Republicans voted early this year than in 2020 in that state. While I want to stress again that early turnout numbers are not necessarily predictive of the final outcome, the numbers are giving both Trump and Harris supporters in Pennsylvania reason to be optimistic. Maybe they'll both win. Wouldn't that be something? In Arizona, Republican turnout is dwarfing Democrat turnout by at least 200,000. We should note, again, these figures are similar to 2016 and the inverse of 2020, where Democrats held the early voting advantage. In Nevada, Republicans have captured 37% of the early vote, while registered Democrats made up 34%. Meanwhile, in North Carolina, things do remain tight, with Republican and Democrat turnout separated by only 1 percentage point. Turnout is similarly tight in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Georgia. Georgia has seen a record number of early voter turnout, with roughly 4 million ballots cast, 4 million, representing more than 55% of active voters. I want to stress again that this is all just a limited snapshot, of course, and early voting data is not necessarily indicative of which way the final tally will swing. Speaking of caution, election analysts are warning voters not to put too much stock into the early results, which, of course, will begin to trickle in later today. They point to 2020, where some states saw what officials dubbed a, quote, red mirage, which showed Trump leading on election night before a, quote, blue shift, who comes up with these names, gave the advantage to Biden as mail-in ballots began to be counted. Analysts say that could happen again, particularly in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, though they don't expect the shift to be as significant as it was in 2020. Conversely, they also warn that a, quote, blue mirage could occur for Democrats early in the evening, only for a, quote, red shift, you see where this is all going, to reverse the trend. They say Democrats are particularly vulnerable to this phenomena in North Carolina and Georgia. Okay, well, that said, barring an unexpected blowout, which pollsters have said could happen, really anything could happen. Apparently, nobody knows what's going on. If there's a widespread polling error, we may not know the final tally for days. As a reminder, Pennsylvania did not announce a clear winner until 4 days after the election in 2020. In North Carolina, a winner wasn't declared until 10 days after the vote. Remember that? And in Nevada, it took 5 days. Now, look, no offense, but with all the money and effort put into the election process, frankly, there's no excuse for Americans not to know who won by the end of the night on Election Day. The fact that some states seem incapable or too dysfunctional to count their votes quickly and efficiently and have an answer by the end of the evening, well, that whole process is incredibly damaging to the credibility of the system. And finally, here's my prediction for the election, because I know you were waiting for that. My prediction is, when the dust settles and the results are in, one half of the country will be unhappy. There, you can take that to the bank. Coming up, an update on the war in Ukraine, as the first reports emerge that Ukrainian forces have engaged in combat with North Korean troops fighting on behalf of Russia. I'll be right back. Welcome back to the Afternoon Bulletin. I want to turn now to Ukraine, which has announced skirmishes with North Korean troops in Russia's Kursk region, marking the first direct engagement since the soldiers reportedly joined Russia's western border. On Monday, Andrei Kovalenko, head of the Ukraine National Security and Defense Council's anti-disinformation body, shared on Telegram that North Korean troops had already, quote, come under fire in the Kursk region. Though details were limited, the move signals an intensification on Russia's part, with Kursk serving as a staging area for Russian and North Korean troops aimed at countering Ukrainian incursions. For background, you'll recall Ukrainian forces previously captured sections of Kursk in Russia in a surprise incursion in August, pressuring Russia's defenses along this border area. And of course, that was the first time that foreign troops had entered into Russia and captured territory since World War II. Pentagon spokesman Major General Pat Ryder stated Monday, quote, we think that the total number of Democratic People's Republic of Korea forces in Russia could be closer to around 11 to 12,000, adding, quote, at least 10,000 right now are in the Kursk region. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte referred to the influx of North Korean forces as a, quote, significant escalation. Well, that's not a statement of the obvious, is it? Signaling deepening ties between Moscow and Pyongyang, alarming the U.S. and, of course, its NATO allies. But the inclusion of North Korean troops is not necessarily going well for Russian forces. Compounding the complexity of the conflict, a video shared on social media by a pro-Ukrainian X account alleged a captured Russian soldier detailed troubling conduct among North Korean recruits. The soldier recounted an incident during a trench-digging assignment with his unit and 10 North Korean soldiers. The soldier described a chaotic moment during an assault, stating, quote, the Koreans started firing at us. He added, quote, we tried to explain to them where to aim, but I think they shot 2 of our own, meaning 2 of the Russian soldiers, underscoring the communication breakdown among the new recruits. The soldier, fearing for his life, ultimately surrendered, stating, quote, I decided it was better to surrender in this situation than to be killed by our own bullet. The video's authenticity has not been independently verified, though it has attracted significant attention. Following reports of North Korean involvement, Ukrainian President Zelensky on Monday met with his military officials, reiterating Ukraine's reliance on Western aid. Zelensky acknowledged a rise in artillery supplies from allies, while instructing his defense minister to increase drone production to counter Russian assaults. However, Zelensky at the same time continues to criticize Western nations for delaying authorization of long-range weaponry, which, of course, could enable Ukraine to strike deep into Russian-held areas. In an address last week, Zelensky emphasized the urgency of these requests, stating, quote, instead of providing much-needed long-range capabilities, America is watching, Britain is watching, Germany is watching. Everyone is just waiting for the North Korean military to start targeting Ukrainians, end quote. Meanwhile, Russia has ramped up airstrikes across Ukraine, targeting key cities and civilian infrastructure. In the last week of October, Russia dropped over 900 bombs, launched 30 missiles, and sent nearly 500 Iranian-made Shahed drones, according to Zelensky's latest update. And that, my friends, is the PDB Afternoon Bulletin for Tuesday, 5 November. Now, if you have any questions or comments, please reach out to me at pdb@thefirsttv.com. And as you may have heard, to listen to the show ad-free, become a premium member of the President's Daily Brief by visiting pdbpremium.com. It could not be any easier. I'm Mike Baker. I'll be back tomorrow. Until then, stay informed, stay safe, stay cool.